just waiting for the space to fill up. The Ambassador Polyanskiy will be here, obviously, in about 5 minutes, give or take. I This won't be. This will be very short. He only has about 30 to 45 minutes with us. But we will close this space and then hold a discussion space immediately following if there's interest. This space is recorded, just so you guys know, but the discussion space after this will not be recorded. Ben and Tyler, if you guys want to discuss anything before he gets into the room, just to break the awkward silence.
I've just been reading through stuff and boning up on current events just to try and make sure that the questions I ask are relevant if I get to ask them, that is. I imagine there's going to be a lot of people who are interested in asking questions.
I have a big pool, but it seems like people kind of ask the same types of questions. So I'm hoping that we'll ask stuff broadly enough that like a lot of people's questions get answered.
Should we go over it with that any questions that we cannot ask or any topics that we should not discuss?
He didn't say any, but I think that we might not want to get into too much like very sensitive information, like questions about the most recent drone strikes at the airfield. I highly doubt he can even talk about that.
Right, of course. Okay.
But also,
he might.
If the listeners have any questions or comments, put them in the chat in the comment section of the space, and we'll try to pack in as much as we can. I don't personally have that many questions because I can ask questions whenever I want. So this is mostly for you guys and your questions. So yeah, I'm hoping to pack in as much as I can.
Perfect. Thank you.
I've been looking forward to this space all week long, thinking about it. It's interesting. He actually came on to a space that I was on a few months ago, and very articulate, very forthcoming, answered everybody's questions. Seems to be a really nice man.
I've been scheduling this for 8 months. I think we've been scheduling this for 8 months. Conversations for 8 months, and finally it just did it.
Well, I imagine he's very busy and hard to get a hold of for something like this.
I sent him the link, so maybe any minute now.
It's been kind of quiet the last few days as far as news from certain areas are concerned. Very interesting developments in Africa, however. I am really surprised at how many different countries are rising up to say enough is enough. And I was shocked to see the bags of cash in the president of Gabon's house being taken out. That was amazing to me. Like, oh my gosh, how does that happen?
I'm quite leery of this coup in whatever you want to call it. This turnover in Gabon. It just feels weird and doesn't feel as authentic as Niger or Burkina Faso.
So, yeah, I've very much the same for me. I have read some things that make me think that it's possible that this was a U.S.-backed coup. So, for me, it looks like it might be an attempt for the U.S. to try and step in and maybe take away some territory territorial influence from France. I'm not sure, but that's what it feels like for me right now.
It also feels that what US is doing is that they're trying to create a lot more conflict within the African regions. So perhaps they can go in, and NATO can go in, France and US can go in and just start another war like we always do.
I think also we need to remember that in the case of Gabon, if you look at its economic record, as I tweeted a few days ago, since the 1970s, it's been on a pretty firm downward trajectory and dominated by a one-family oligarchy. But since they haven't even managed to maintain the standards that they reached in the mid-70s, well, I think that there's a lot of rather patience is wearing rather thin. So I think that it's right to be wary, but I also think that you need to remember that there are a lot of deficiencies, but our guest of honor has arrived.
Yay, let's go.
I can't see him. There we go. There we go. I've got him. Welcome, sir. Welcome to our humble space.
Yes, it's an honor for me. Thank you. How do you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. You sound great. How are you today? Happy Friday.
Not bad. Thank you. Happy Friday to you. It's a long weekend ahead.
Oh, that's right. It is. So, I do want to get started because I know you're kind of strapped for time and I don't want to monopolize it. So, if you could, just for some of our listeners, maybe do a really short recap on what led to the special military operation, but not from a war perspective, more from diplomatic means that what were used and which organizations and the lack of response and interest that they met.
Yes, sure. Sure, I'm very pleased to do so. I think that more and more people nowadays, when they analyze the situation, the facts, they understand that the history with Ukraine, with Ukrainian crisis, hasn't started on the 24th of February of 2022. Actually, there were different stages of this crisis. The most acute one started in 2014 when there was this unconstitutional coup d'etat, which we call Maidan coup d'etat, promoted by the US and its allies in Kiev. And all of a sudden, the authorities were monopolized. The power structures were monopolized by those who are radical and nationalist and Russophobic, and that's why they started to conduct policies that actually were not supported by the population in the east and in the south, and to a certain extent, this population started to resist. You know that there were terrible events in Odessa in May 2014 when about 50 peaceful protesters were burnt alive in the house of trade unions. There were clashes in Mariupol. There were clashes elsewhere, but the most serious resistance was noticed in Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which later became Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. So these events, these whole problems of Ukraine that Ukraine is facing right now, they date back at least to that moment. But to be more precise and to be more strict, we need to go back even before that, when the nationalist agenda started to be introduced in Ukraine, when people who immigrated after the Second World War and their descendants came back to Ukraine with a nationalist ideology, and they started to promote the values honoring those who were Hitler's collaborators. And all of a sudden, those who were liberating Ukraine from fascism were no longer worshipped in Western Ukraine, and instead of them, such people as Bandera and Shukhevich and others who were collaborating with Hitler and who were perpetrators of Holocaust started to be worshipped, and Bandera became the national hero of Ukraine. That were the first, I would say, the first signs of the looming crisis. And again, it became quite acute in 2014. The first attempt was made in 2004 when there was this Orange Revolution, but then the majority of population did not support these governments and these leaders imposed by the West, and the West had to make a pause. So the current Ukraine is a total geopolitical project of the West. Its only aim is to be a tool of weakening Russia, of promoting Western geopolitical interests, and the West absolutely doesn't care about Ukraine, about Ukrainians. I think that's quite obvious right now, and more people are asking themselves the question: what is the end game for Ukraine in this Western equation that they are now trying to solve? You mentioned international organizations. I would say that maybe I should single out, of course, European Union, which signed association agreement with Ukraine in 2014, and in 2013 the Ukrainian leadership at this moment, the Yanukovych government, they declined to sign this agreement. They did not reject it, but they said that they needed more time to calculate all the benefits, all the pro and cons of this agreement, because many people understood that implementation of this agreement would jeopardize Ukraine's relations and ties with Russia. So EU played a major role in this crisis, in provoking this crisis. This association agreement is much deeper than the free trade agreement that EU has with several other countries. It's an association agreement. It requires a lot of things from Ukraine. Of course, one needs to mention NATO, because the issue of Ukrainian membership of NATO was very contentious for quite a long time, and I think we made it absolutely clear in 2007 that when President Putin was speaking in Munich, we made it absolutely clear that the Ukraine joining NATO is absolutely a red line for us. And as you know, it's not only about Ukraine. We were consistently for quite a long time opposing the expansion of NATO, because this is an alliance of the Cold War. And it was absolutely not part of the deal, part of the agreement between Soviet leaders and Western leaders at the beginning of the 90s, that the bloc of NATO would survive and would expand further. So it's a breach of all the understandings and all the agreements. And of course, the direct casus belli that was actually that happened in 2022 was this desire of NATO to include Ukraine. We tried to avert this crisis. We made several attempts. We made several proposals on how to deal with this situation. Our main priority was the respect for the rights of Russian-speaking population in the East and in the West, because Kiev regime started a war against its own citizens in 2014, and our whole idea of our special military operation was to stop this war and to stop the shelling of peaceful cities and towns of women and elderly in the east of Ukraine. That was our main aim, and you know that Minsk agreements were specifically designed to lead us to this aim. Their end game was return of these regions to Ukrainian rule, but with a big degree of sovereignty and autonomy, especially for Russian language and in matters concerning the history of the Second World War. But Ukraine and its Western sponsors rejected these agreements. They did it absolutely distinctly in 2022. on the eve of our special military operation, and this was also one of the reasons why we had to start it. And I need also to mention in this connection the third organization, which also played quite a negative role. It's OSCE, because OSCE was monitoring the implementation of Minsk agreements. But in fact, as we know now, it was not only not doing its job, but it was also playing into the hand of Kiev regime, providing it with information about rebels in Donetsk and Lugansk, which was absolutely not part of its mandate. But now we have the documents and the facts that would show us that OSCE special monitoring mission was part of a problem and not part of a solution. So that's in a nutshell. How can I sum up our road to where we are right now? And I am absolutely at your disposal to answer further questions.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for that opening. You work as Deputy Ambassador in the United Nations. How would you say the UN General Assembly and Security Council have changed, if at all, since the start of the special military operation?
I can tell you that at the beginning, of course, no one was prepared for such a development of the events because it all started quite quickly, and people were still hoping that there will be a diplomatic solution to all the contradictions that were becoming more and more acute. So if we travel back to February 2022, February, March, April, I think that a lot of countries from global south were disoriented, and they didn't know what was happening, and Western countries were very active in promoting anti-Russian narrative, black and white narrative, that Russia is bad and the West is good, and that they are defending Ukraine, and that the Ukrainian regime is a victim of Russian aggression, and all these things. And they managed to mobilize support from about 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly, and they managed to take several decisions within the framework of a special session that was called after the beginning of our special military operation. Security Council, it's a different story because it is dominated by Western countries, and that's one of the reasons why we are promoting the issue of reform of Security Council, because it doesn't represent the moods in the world and the position of most countries of the world. But both in this General Assembly and Security Council, most visibly in the General Assembly, the support for Western narrative on Ukraine is waning, and it's more and more clear that this trend is dominating. A lot of countries just don't want to blindly support Western countries who are not only doing nothing to stop the military activities in Ukraine, but they are beefing up Kiev regime with arms and ammunitions, and sending mercenaries there and providing it with military data, clearly becoming part of the conflict, just not directly having a war with Russia, but rather a proxy war. So a lot of countries now understand the realities, and they understand that the policies of the Western countries led us to this crisis, to the hot stage of this crisis. And it's, of course, the finding a solution also needs some kind of efforts from Western countries, which they don't want to deploy. And that's the situation as seen by many of our partners. And it is more and more difficult for Ukraine and its Western backers to mobilize support in the General Assembly or elsewhere for anti-Russian initiatives, especially when it was told to the world that the peace in Ukraine was within reach more than a year ago in March, when there was a peaceful plan which was approved by Ukraine, by Ukrainian negotiators. And the Ukrainian authorities were ready to agree on this plan, and this plan would keep Ukraine as it is, with several conditions, with the guarantees for the Russian-speaking population, and with the issue of demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, and not and Ukraine becoming a neutral country, not joining NATO. So all these principles were supported by Ukrainian government, but then some Western countries, namely the United Kingdom and United States, stepped in, and they convinced the Zelensky regime that with the help of the West, with the help of Western armaments, Ukraine is capable of defeating Russia, and that was a tragic mistake for Ukraine, for Kiev regime. And now we are seeing what we're seeing on the battlefield is absolutely showing that Ukraine is holding out only because of Western supplies. It has squandered several armies of its own, and the military situation is very bad for Ukraine, and the Western countries don't know what to do, how to help Ukraine to survive and to kind of make more problems and headaches for Russia. So from the military point of view, the situation on the battlefield is not absolutely not in the benefit of Ukraine right now. So and also people in our colleagues in General Assembly and in the United Nations, they also see this trend. They understand that the warmongers, the Western warmongers, are the ones who are responsible for this crisis, and it's not very easy to convince them into anti-Russian initiatives in the United Nations, and that makes our Western counterparts quite mad, and they feel that they are a little bit isolated. So any anti-Russian initiative now enjoys something about 60, 65, 70 maximum backers, mostly from Western countries and their closest allies. But the majority of the members of the General Assembly, they are reluctant to support such anti-Russian moves because the situation is much more complex than the Western countries try to present it to be.
Thank you so much for your answer. Anna, did you want to go and ask about?
I did. Thank you. Dmitry, it's a pleasure to meet you. I had a question. Recently, Tucker Carlson had an interview, and he said something extremely important. I think for all of us. He said that he believes that United States and Russia will be in hot war in the next year or so. What are your thoughts on this? What are your feelings on this? What is Russian government thinks about this type of possibility? And how scary is this to possibly have two major nuclear powers to go to war with each other? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anna, for this question. It's not up to us to weigh the probability of this scenario. We have been warning repeatedly and consistently that the situation is quite dangerous and there is a big risk of direct clash between Russia and NATO. Actually, NATO is very much involved in what's happening in Ukraine. It's providing with satellite intelligence data, with other means. Of course, it provides ammunition, arms, everything, but maybe manpower. But we don't know for sure because there are a lot of indications that there are some kind of instructors and mercenaries, and some people are very mysteriously declared dead back home, even generals and officers from NATO. So this is all very suspicious. We can't exclude that they participate in some kind of activities in Ukraine. So of course the danger is very big, and I mentioned that militarily the situation is very bad for Kiev regime, and everyone understands that its only lifeline is Western support. So Western support is also waning a little bit, and I think that in the United States a lot of people, as elsewhere, start to realize that Kiev regime is losing. And there are a lot of hawks in Washington that, of course, wouldn't like to have this scenario, and we don't know what they can think of to keep Kiev regime alive and not to see their geopolitical plans vis-a-vis Russia to go bankrupt. I think that's what Tucker was mentioning. He was speaking hypothetically. We don't have crystal ball in our hands, so everything can happen, and nothing is excluded when there is such a close military clash, even if a proxy clash between NATO and Russia. So you never know what will happen at the next stage. And of course, this is a very dangerous situation. And I really don't think that I should comment more on this, because this would be mere speculation. But again, I would say that the danger of direct clash is always there. It's not our choice, it's the choice of NATO, which can at any moment stop supporting Kiev regime, and then I think the whole war will be over quite soon. And a lot of analytics and specialists, analysts and specialists, including I think Tucker Carlson, were repeatedly saying that this is the scenario that would follow if Kiev regime all of a sudden will not have Western support.
Thank you for that.
Go ahead, Tyler.
It's a pleasure to have you here, sir. Thank you very much for answering our questions. So my question is this. There's been a lot of talk over the last year about red lines being crossed. And recently there was that drone attack. And there was some speculation around the fact that it may have been initially, launched via Estonia. And then later on, it was said that it was possible that the UAVs actually just flew through Estonian territory. So as far as a response from you at the UN, would you be discussing, the red lines being crossed and the possibility of reprisals? Where do you go in this sort of situation?
Well, thank you, Tyler, for the question. I think that all the red lines have already been crossed repeatedly, and we indicated this. So it's very hard to see what crimes NATO hasn't committed in their futile attempts to bring strategic defeat to Russia. I'm not aware of real trajectory of these drones. I think there are people in my country who are specialists and who are earning money for this, who analyze this data, and maybe they will come with certain conclusions about this. I know that there are multiple drone attacks. There are attacks all over Russian territory. There are a lot of indications about this every day. And this is a serious factor, but this is not a military response, I would say. Everybody understands that from the military point of view, all these attacks, the vast majority of which are intercepted and prevented, all these attacks are not meaningful in terms of military strategy. It's the only task of these attacks would be to kind of deflect attention of Ukrainians from very catastrophic situation in the fronts, on the front line, because Ukraine is clearly losing, and the Kiev regime is willing to show that it is capable of inflicting certain damage to Russia. There is, of course, damage and there are explosions, but this is very limited, and we are also learning lessons, and now we are more and more capable every day of countering these attacks. But all these attacks, I would say, this is kind of a very terrorist pattern of Kiev regime, because we repeatedly said in the UN, in the Security Council, that Russia is making high precision strikes on the objects that are linked to the military capacities of the Kiev regime. It can be energy infrastructure or logistical infrastructure, but it's quite clear from the news, from the videos that there are in the internet, that Russian strikes are made with high precision weapons, and they are not targeting civilians. So the civilians' casualties that happen, they happen because of the work of Ukrainian anti-missile defense, because it's obsolete, because it's placed in the residential areas against and in full breach of international humanitarian law. So it's because of either missiles are deflected by the work of this air defense, or which happens most frequently, as it happened in Odessa recently with the cathedral, for example. It's the missiles of air defense simply miss the target and they fall in residential areas. If they were situated on the outskirts, then the consequences would have been absolutely different. If you read Ukrainian or Russian, and you will take an effort to study Ukrainian Telegram channels or news channels, you will see that there are a lot of warnings, even from the Ukrainians themselves, which clearly show that Ukrainians are not fearful of Russian attacks. They are fearful of their own air defense, which inflicts all this damage to civilian infrastructure and which kills civilians. So they know that Russia is not after civilians. Now, Russia is not behaving in the way the Ukrainian regime is behaving, because when Ukrainian regime is firing in Donetsk and Lugansk and now in Russia and Russian territory, in the mainland Russia, it targets civilians specifically. It uses cluster munitions to target civilians in Donetsk and Lugansk, and this is absolutely different. This is clearly terrorist motivations from the outset. There are terrorist attacks against non-military infrastructure, like the bridge to Crimea, which is not used for military deliveries, and everybody knows this. So the way these attacks are being committed, it very much resembles the tactics of Islamic terrorists, because, as you might know, the driver of the lorry who carried the explosives during the first attack against Crimea bridge was not aware that he was transporting something explosive. So he was used without himself knowing. This is a very terrorist tactics, and that is the difference between our military strategy, our military activities, and the terrorist activities of Kiev regime. And we also try to make it absolutely clear in the United Nations.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ben.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you for joining us. I have a few questions if there's time. Feel free to keep your answers short. My first question is regarding Nicaragua. I'm an anti-imperialist journalist who's lived here for 2 years, and I know that Nicaragua has been one of the most vocal supporters of Russia and the situation in Ukraine. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate sort of how you see the relationship developing with Nicaragua. One of the biggest issues I've experienced and seen people experience since living here is energy prices. I know a while back there was discussion of potentially something happening in that area. So if you could elaborate on that, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Well, Nicaragua is clearly one of our best friends and allies in the world and in the region specifically. I'm not an expert on bilateral relations. I'm dealing with multilateral setting here in the United Nations, but I can tell you that we interact very closely in the United Nations. We are members of so-called Group of the Friends of the United Nations Charter, together with Nicaragua and some other allies, which is becoming more and more influential in the UN. So we are defending of principles of international law, which shouldn't be confused with the principles of rules-based international order, which is the order created by Western countries trying to force everyone to implement what they are planning and what they are doing. So Nicaragua is very vocal here. Nicaragua is an important member in international relations, very vocal player and very visible player. And I think that our relations with this country are becoming more and more close. I heard about recent exchanges that would make our relations even more visible and fruitful, both for Nicaragua and for Russia. But I clearly don't have details at my disposal to be more precise on this.
Sure. And, you know, from my experience, I see Russia's presence very, very much welcome amongst the population in Nicaragua. So my next question is that the United the United States is clearly failing in Ukraine, and tensions are extremely high in West Africa right now. Are you worried about the potential of a hot war breaking out? And if so, do you believe that the U.S. may attempt to pivot from Ukraine to Nicaragua, rather to West Africa or Africa in general, in an attempt to preserve their hegemony and save face?
It's very difficult for me to predict the behavior of the United States. I think there are a lot of regions and situations in the world where potential US actions can bring us to a hot conflict, both between Russia and US, or between China and US. And US is a known warmonger for many years. So situation in West Africa, I don't think that there are direct clashes and direct interaction of forces between Russia and the United States there. As to my knowledge, I don't know about any Russian regular forces there in these countries. I know that there are rumors about some private military companies which are being chosen by African countries. But there are situations when Western private military companies are also chosen by certain governments. So I wouldn't make the same comparison between what's happening in Ukraine, where NATO is trying to prop up the Ukrainian army with everything they can, including with specialists and instructors and armaments, and West Africa, where there is the situation of, if I can say so, of African Spring, when a lot of African governments are realizing that they need to defend their own interests and pursue more independent policy in the world. And this is, of course, very disappointing for Western governments who want to maintain their control of these regions. But I think this is an objective trend, and it's hard to really to block this trend, and it's up to African countries and peoples to choose their future. We are very much supportive of this, and we have always been so, even since the time of the Soviet Union, and I think that they remember our support. So same about people elsewhere in the world. We would always support countries who are not afraid of promoting their own values and their own priorities in Africa or elsewhere. And I think that's also one thing that the West doesn't like about Russia.
Yeah, it certainly seems like the history of Russia's efforts in Africa is very much unmistakable. So my last question, if there's time, is that many people have spoken about BRICS as a rival to the G7, but the UN Security Council has been increasingly sort of a roadblock to building a more just world and having real resolutions to major problems. And I don't think there's a clear path to including more members in the permanent Security Council. So do you see BRICS eventually becoming sort of an alternative to the United Nations as well? And thank you for your time.
Thank you for your questions. I don't think that we should really view this situation through the optics that you explained. I don't think that BRICS is an alternative to the United Nations. It may be an alternative to G7, maybe because of countries that participate there, but it's really not an alternative to the UN, because UN is a core of multilateral system. We all support the idea of multilateralism, and I think that UN is a good tool. It's a right tool. It was rightly designed after the Second World War. And the problem is that this tool is not always used properly in accordance with the instructions, in accordance with the UN Charter. So I don't think that the problem is in the UN itself, in the way it was designed. Of course, one can make it better. There are a lot of efforts to bring about reform of the General Assembly of the Security Council, and I think that at some point of time these efforts will succeed. But the construction itself is correct, and BRICS is absolutely different thing. It's more about finances and economics. Of course, there is a political component, but it's something in support of United Nations, of true multilateralism. BRICS is about true multilateralism, the same core ideas that are behind the United Nations. In the United Nations, the Western countries managed to do a lot of harm to multilateralism, but of course they have no influence at BRICS, and that's why BRICS is so attractive for a lot of countries of the world, and a lot of people are really having high hopes on BRICS because of what BRICS countries are promoting. So I think that we shouldn't confuse these two things, United Nations and BRICS, and we shouldn't put them as contradictory poles of international politics.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead, just me. Sorry, guys. He's on a desktop and he can't raise his hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, very sorry about this, everybody. But, Mr. Ambassador, currently one of the main international points of pressure, at least from what we can read in the press, is for Russia to return to the so-called Black Sea grain deal. However, the government of the Russian Federation has stated that it will not return until, first, some promises which were made to Russia are met. Could you tell us what those promises were in the context of the grain deal, and to the extent that you can, what discussions are being held on this and what a solution could be?
Thank you for this question. I think we quite extensively covered this issue in July. I personally delivered several speeches in this regard, and everybody can get them in full detail of what we were saying. There were several statements from Russian foreign ministries, and even the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, himself explained what are the problems in the grain deal. The main problem is that when it was concluded in July 2022, there were two parts of this agreement. One of them was the task of one part of grain initiative was to bring Ukrainian grain to the countries in need. So it was a humanitarian project. The other task was to bring Russian food products, including grain and also fertilizers, to world markets. So these were two same elements, two halves of one brain that was promoted by the United Nations. And it was absolutely clear that the equilibrium was achieved because these two parts of the same deal were to be implemented meticulously. But what happened next was that Western countries started to prioritize, to put it mildly, the Ukrainian grain initiative. The Ukrainian grain initiative, Black Sea grain initiative, very, very clearly and very soon, instead of humanitarian one, became a commercial one. And the grain from Ukraine was going to wealthy countries, to European countries, to those countries who were making money because of this grain, but not to the countries in need. So one thing that we demand is to change, we were demanding this when the initiative was still alive. So to change the character of this initiative and to make it humanitarian again. Everybody knows also that Ukraine was using the humanitarian corridor that was safeguarded because of the implementation of this initiative for military purposes, for attacks on Russian infrastructure, military and civilian objects, which is absolutely contrary to the agreement that was achieved. We demanded to put an end to this repeatedly, but we were not heard. And the second part of this deal about Russian fertilizers and food products was not implemented at all. So it required certain considerable moves on behalf of Western countries who formally do not impose sanctions on Russian agriculture and fertilizers, but because of the other measures, the companies who are dealing with this are not capable of implementing the second part of the deal. They are very much afraid of sanctions, of repercussions. The financial transactions can't happen because the Russian Agriculture Bank, which is responsible for this part of our economy, is not capable of making or receiving payments. And one of the demands was to re-SWIFT this bank back to the international system for making these transactions possible. There was a question of rate of insurance to Russian deliveries. There was a question of Russian fertilizers, which were kept in some European ports, confiscated, and we were ready to provide these fertilizers free of charge to countries in need in Africa. There were questions of spare parts for our agricultural machinery, which also became a problem after the introduction of Western sanctions. So all these things were clearly on the paper, not to mention the ammonia pipeline, Taliati-Odessa, which was also part of the deal, and which Secretary General promised to us that it will be operational, but Ukraine started to blackmail everyone. And you know that I think in June or in May they blew up this pipeline. I think closing this issue at all. So it was absolutely clear that the Western countries, they do not want to implement the Russian part of the deal, but they are keen to provide further implementation for Ukrainian part, which was distorted, as I said. It was no longer humanitarian, and we were demanding to put an end to this, and we were also citing figures that Russian agriculture, Russian grain is much more important for world markets. So Ukraine was providing only 5% of world grain, whereas Russia was providing 20%. So even from the point of view of mere arithmetic, it's clear that Russian grain is more important for the world than Ukrainian one, not to mention fertilizers from Russia, which is absolutely indispensable to a lot of countries in the world. So all this together in combination brought us to this decision to quit this deal, because this deal was no longer serving the interests and the principles agreed upon a year ago. And I think that was a clear decision. There was also a clear statement that we would be ready to consider returning to this deal when the conditions that I specified are met. And I think there is nothing extraordinary about this. We're just asking the West to honor its obligations, clear obligations, which were formulated on paper. I think I have one question, time for one more question, and I'm afraid that I need to go after that.
Okay, then I'm going to steal it. So we talked about the grain deal. So I want to talk about Odessa. So what is the future scenario if Russia if peace is achieved without the reunification of Odessa? And what are the implications for places like the PMR or Abkhazia or Ossetia? Don't you believe that Russia needs to extend land bridge to Transnistria, and other breakaway republics will also need to be assisted?
These are all hypothetical scenarios, and I really don't believe that I am in a position to discuss hypothetics. I'm a diplomat. I have my instructions. I have certain facts that I can analyze. I read a lot of opinions in this regard. Some people say that it is indispensable to move in this direction. The others say that we shouldn't. But there is one thing that I want to make absolutely clear, is that we started this special military operation because there was a Russophobic hornet's nest created at our borders. The hornet's nest that is very dangerous for my country, and where the clear threat to my country is coming from. Also, we were defending the Russian-speaking population, which faced something close to genocide because of the Ukrainian actions. This was the other reason. So I'm absolutely sure that these aims of special military operation will be implemented sooner or later. I hope that better sooner than later. And I think it's in the core interests of Ukraine, because the more Ukraine is dragged into this conflict, the less chances for this country to survive as it is are there on the surface. And I would say that it's a pity, because whenever, regardless of what some people speculate, whenever Putin aimed to Russify Ukraine, to end Ukraine as an independent state, to impose Russian on Ukrainian speakers, no, we absolutely didn't have these objectives. The objectives are, as I just described it. But the more Ukraine is dragged into this conflict, which is happening only because of Western geopolitical interests, I think that the less positive scenarios are there in store for this country, and everybody understands this. And I think that this is something that also drives West very mad at this stage, because they can't do anything without risking direct clash with Russia. So that's everything I can say in this regard, and I can assure you that we're absolutely confident of our victory, which will come inevitably, and I hope that quite soon. And I thank everybody for support. I receive a lot of letters, a lot of appeals from United States, from Europe, from other countries, from people who don't have any other opportunities to make their opinion heard. And you know that we also bring into the Security Council some of the journalists, some of the experts who also don't have a platform to express their views, and who are sick and tired of mainstream media, which is only brainwashing Americans and Europeans, and which do not show any facts and do not bring any truth. So that's what we will be doing, and I think that everybody who is participating in this effort should be thanked, because it's very important to bring the truth to those in the world who need this truth right now. Thank you very much. I am afraid I need to quit
Thank you so much, sir, for your time.
room. Yes, but I'm at your disposal. Thank you.
We will talk soon. Okay, everyone, I am going to close this space, and then we will open up an after discussion space if that's what you're all interested in, and we talk about whatever. I just don't want to do it in here because it's still recorded, and I don't like recording discussion spaces. So we'll close this and we'll start a new one, and hopefully we will see you guys there.